In the quiet corridors of power, there are conversations the world was never meant to hear. Two leaders, oceans apart, bound by an unspoken understanding and a shared ambition. One is a man whose words can ignite a crowd or silence a room, Donald Trump. The other, a leader whose every handshake carries the weight of a billion hopes, Narendra Modi. But in the shadows of their private dialogue, a name emerges, Jaishankar, and with it a story that could shift the balance of diplomacy forever. Tonight we step into that room where the words where history began to take a different path. The untold conversation that broke diplomatic silence. Jaishankar wrote in a high-stakes game, power moves hidden the world suspects. And what really happened, how one private echoed decades in for decades, and one private meeting could privately polite words, the power between words. Jaishankar's unexiled hidden role in the heart of diplomacy. Some moments are meant to be etched into history books, while others are designed to vanish into the ether, known only to the few who were there. This was one of those moments. Behind closed doors, afar from the reach of cameras and recorders, Donald Trump and Narendra Modi sat across from each other in a room thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The atmosphere was not tense, yet it was charged. A quiet electricity born from the knowledge that what would be said in that room could never be fully repeated outside of it. This was not the arena for grand speeches or public declarations. This was the place where silence became a tool, where pauses spoke louder than proclamations, and where the smallest phrase could carry the force of a tidal wave. The untold conversation began not with grand statements, but with subtle nods and careful words, as if both men were acutely aware that the walls had ears. Their tones were measured, their expressions studied. Here, the performance of politics was stripped away, replaced by the raw calculus of mutual interests and the shared understanding that power often thrives in shadows. In this hidden space, the smiles were smaller, the handshakes firmer, and every sentence had layers meant to be read by the listener and no one else. There is something inherently dangerous and compelling about a conversation that cannot be publicly acknowledged. It creates a magnetic pull for those who hear whispers about it later. The public will wonder, speculate, and spin their own tales, but the reality often lies in far quieter exchanges. Exchanges that can shape alliances or fracture them. This particular dialogue carried that kind of weight. Both men understood the delicate balance of their nation's interests, the unpredictable nature of global politics, and the need for certain matters to remain beyond the reach of news headlines. Some say that in diplomacy, the truth is rarely told in its entirety. Not because it is unworthy, but because it is too valuable to be handled carelessly. This conversation was a perfect example. Between each line, there was a negotiation not of contracts or treaties, but of trust itself. It was about understanding what the other would never say out loud, and yet somehow communicating it all the same. Here, silence wasn't a void, it was an unspoken agreement. When it ended, there was no signature on paper, no formal announcement, and certainly no evidence that the meeting had occurred in the way it truly had. Yet both leaders left knowing that something significant had been exchanged. Something more powerful than any signed document. The conversation, untold and unconfirmed, would live on not in archives, but in the quiet corridors of influence. It would shape future decisions, guide unseen hands, and remain a story half hidden in the shadows of history, known fully only to the men who sat in that room and the few trusted enough to hear its echoes. Jaishankar's name entered the discussion like a stone dropped into still water. Quiet at first, but sending ripples in every direction. It was not a casual mention, nor the filler of polite conversation. It was deliberate, calculated, and loaded with implications that only seasoned statesmen could fully appreciate. Both Trump and Modi knew exactly what that name represented. It was not just a person, it was a symbol of India's strategic voice. The diplomat who could navigate stormy waters with an unshakable calm. In the theater of global politics, Jaishankar was not a background player. He was the man you sent when the stakes were too high to risk a misstep. Trump leaned forward slightly, his tone a mix of curiosity and respect, probing for insights. Modi's response was steady, as if measuring each word against the scale of what could be revealed. Between them, Jaishankar be the thread weaving together unspoken concerns and unvoiced agreements. His reputation had reached beyond Delhi's corridors of power. It had crossed oceans, entered boardrooms, and found its way into conversations like this one, where every name carried the weight of influence. What made Jaishankar's role so remarkable was his ability to occupy a space that few could. He was the rare diplomat who could be both precise and elusive, offering enough clarity to move a discussion forward while leaving just enough unsaid to keep leverage intact. For Trump, this was intriguing. For Modi, it was invaluable. In a world where messages are often twisted by the time they reach their destination, having someone who controlled the narrative at every stage was not just an advantage. It was a necessity. The conversation moved between topics, but whenever it touched on sensitive matters, trade, defense, shifting alliances, Jaishankar's influence was there, an invisible hand guiding the shape of the dialogue. Modi spoke of trust, of strategic patience, of how timing was as important as action itself. Trump listened, occasionally interjecting, but it was clear that the name they had both acknowledged was now a silent presence in the room. There was an understanding forming, one not bound by written agreements, but by mutual recognition of capability. In Trump's mind, Jaishankar was not just India's foreign minister. He was a signal, a message in human form, that India was playing the long game with a strategist who understood both the spoken and unspoken rules of global engagement. Modi, for his part, was aware that even in mentioning Jaishankar, he had drawn attention to India's ability to navigate between competing powers without losing its footing. By the time the meeting moved on to other matters, the air between them had shifted. They had not discussed Jankar's every move or philosophy, but they didn't need to. His name alone had carried the weight of entire strategies. The promise of carefully managed influence, and the certainty that, in the right hands, diplomacy could be a weapon as sharp as any blade. Power, in its most refined form, rarely announces itself. It hides in the creases of conversation, in the pauses between words, in the slight shift of a tone that changes everything. As Trump and Modi spoke, it became clear that beneath the polite language and diplomatic courtesies, there was a game being played, one that relied not on grand gestures, but on the subtle exchange of influence. This was not about signing bold new agreements in front of flashing cameras. It was about understanding where leverage existed and how to use it without letting the other side see your hand too clearly. Each leader understood the rhythm of such encounters. Trump, with his instinct for negotiation, knew when to lean in, when to appear casual, and when to let silence do the talking. Modi, disciplined and deliberate, mirrored that dance, offering just enough to keep the conversation alive, while holding back the pieces that mattered most. Between them, every question had a double meaning, every answer a hidden implication. It was like two seasoned chess players moving their pieces with quiet precision, each anticipating not just the next move, but the chain of moves that could follow. These power moves were never written into official records. They existed in the inflections, in the deliberate choice of which topics to linger on and which to pass over quickly. A mention of trade was never just about economics. It was about security, alliances, and the subtle reminder of what each side could give or take away. A brief reference to military cooperation carried an entire subtext about regional stability and global positioning. In this kind of dialogue, control was the real currency. Whoever could shape the pace of the conversation, decide the weight of each subject, and determine the moment to shift gears held the upper hand. Trump had his ways. Direct, sometimes disarmingly so, pushing boundaries to test the other's resolve. Modi countered with patience, a long game approach that allowed him to absorb pressure without appearing cornered. It was a clash of styles, yet beneath it all was a mutual recognition that they were playing on the same field, each aware of the other's capabilities. What made this exchange so potent that it was not confrontational. On the surface, it was cooperative, even cordial. But beneath that civility, they were maneuvering for position, feeling out the limits, probing for vulnerabilities, and making mental notes of where they apply pressure later. The most significant parts of the discussion were not the agreements they seemed to reach, but the quiet decisions each made about what they would hold back for the right moment. By the end, nothing explosive had been said, yet both men walked away with something valuable, an updated map of the other's intentions. They had traded more than words. They had tested each other's boundaries, established new lines of influence, and left the door open for future moves. In diplomacy, that is how real power shifts. Not with noise, but with precision. Speculation is the lifeblood of politics. It feeds headlines, fuels debates, and keeps the public searching for answers they will never fully receive. But behind that constant hum of curiosity lies a different reality, one known only to the people who were truly there. In the case of Trump and Modi's private exchange, the gap between what the world suspected and what actually transpired was vast. Outside the closed doors, Theories would multiply. Was this about trade? Was it about defense? Was there an unspoken deal, a warning, or perhaps a subtle shift in allegiance? The truth, however, was far more intricate and far less visible. The strength of such a meeting lay in the fact that both leaders understood the inevitability of outside speculation. They knew the world would try to connect dots with incomplete maps, building narratives from fragments. And in many ways, they used that to their advantage by allowing only slivers of information to seep out, just enough to be noticed but never enough to confirm. They created an environment where guessing became a form of distraction. The real work, the true understanding, stayed locked within the room. As the conversation unfolded, there were moments when each man spoke in a way that sounded almost rehearsed. Lines designed not just for the ears in front of them, but for the potential of those lines being repeated in whispers beyond the meeting. These carefully chosen phrases could be interpreted in multiple ways, allowing both Trump and Modi to control the story without ever directly telling it. The unspoken agreement seemed to be that the less that was made explicit, the more flexibility each side retained once the meeting was over. Meanwhile, outside that room, analysts and observers would attempt to read body language, timing, and even travel schedules to piece together what had happened. But the reality was that the most critical exchanges were invisible, buried beneath layers of politeness and indirect language. A single nod, a momentary pause before answering, or a brief, knowing glance could carry more meaning than paragraphs of formal dialogue. These were signals too subtle for cameras, but unmistakable to the ones giving and receiving them. The difference between suspicion and truth in diplomacy is often a chasm that cannot be crossed without trust. And trust in the world of leaders is rarely complete. Trump and Modi were not an RV. They knew that even between ally or strategic partners, there were limits to what could be shared. But within those limits, there was an art to saying just enough to build a bridge without revealing the road beyond it. By the time they left the room, they had given the outside world exactly what it needed to remain curious. Reason to talk, to question, to speculate endlessly. Yet the core of what truly happened remained theirs alone. It was a reminder that in the highest levels of statecraft, the truth isn't hidden because it is dangerous. It's hidden because it is powerful. History is often shaped in moments that seem small at the time. A conversation, a shared glance, a quiet decision made far from the public eye. For Trump and Modi, that private meeting was one of those moments. On the surface, it was simply another diplomatic exchange between two powerful leaders. But within the walls of that room, they touched on matters that could send ripples through decades to come. A single phrase, a shift in tone, a carefully timed silence. These are the tools by which futures are quietly rewritten. What made this meeting so consequential was not the immediate outcome, but the seeds it planted. Neither man was speaking only for today. Both were playing for years ahead. Every statement was weighed not just for its present meaning, but for how it might be interpreted in 5, 10, or even 20 years. In that sense, the conversation was less about resolving the present and more about setting the stage for what would follow. Strategic positioning, the mapping of alliances, the subtle signaling of intentions. These were the invisible threads being woven into the fabric of international relations. The private nature of the exchange allowed them to speak with a frankness impossible in public settings. Without the glare of cameras or immediate judgment of headlines, ideas could be floated, tested, and refined in real time. Risks could be taken without the fear of instant backlash. This freedom gave the discussion a weight that official statements rarely carry. The trust required for such openness did not erase the differences between them, but it did create a space where those differences could be explored honestly without the need to posture for outside audiences. For both leaders, the long-term stakes were clear. This was not about a single policy or a temporary arrangement. It was about shaping the trajectory of their nations in ways that might not be visible for years. The topics they approached, security, trade, influence, were framed in terms of endurance, not urgency. Each man was quietly calculating what role his country would play in the shifting global order and how the relationship between the United States and India be leveraged or recalibrated to fit that vision. When the meeting ended, there was no visible sign that history had been made. There were no signatures, no public declarations, no ceremonial photographs. And yet, both Trump and Modi walked away knowing that they had exchanged something more valuable than any signed document: an understanding. They had glimpsed each other's long game, seen beyond the immediate disputes or alignments, and found points of convergence that could shape decisions for decades. In the years to come, policies might shift, leaders might change, and circumstances might evolve. But somewhere in the undercurrent of future events, the quiet influence of that meeting would remain. An echo of a private moment when two leaders looked beyond the present and into the horizon of history, deciding in silence how it might be written. In the end, the story of that private exchange between Trump and Modi is not about the drama the public imagines. It is about the quiet mechanics of power that most will never see. It is about the way history is nudged, not by grand declarations shouted to the world, but by measured words spoken in guarded rooms. Jaishankar's shadow over the conversation, the subtle tests of will, the deliberate use of silence, the tension between what the world suspects and what truly happened. All of it forms a mosaic of diplomacy at its highest level. What passed between them that day will likely never be revealed in full. Speculation will come and go. Narratives will shift, and the truth will remain carefully protected, not because it is trivial, but because it is the kind of truth that becomes more valuable the fewer people know it. And yet, its effects will be felt in policy shifts, in strategic alignments, in the way both nations move on the global stage. History will not record the pauses, the glances, or the calculated restraint. It will not capture the fact that two men, each carrying the weight of a nation, sat together and spoke in ways that may alter the course of decades. But those moments happened. They mattered. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of influence, The ripples from that conversation are still moving outward, shaping events yet to come and reminding us that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remain untold.